Hi, welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, I'll be featuring the case of Ira Einhorn. This was a suggestion by a friend of the show, Mr. Jenks. Thank you, Mr. Jenks, for the recommendation. Now, let's go ahead and find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Ira Samuel Einhorn was born on May 15th, 1940. His family was considered to be a middle-class Jewish family, but Ira developed a left-wing radical viewpoint by the time he was in his 20s. He was considered by some to be a symbol and a prominent leader of a youth-driven movement in the 60s that stood in opposition of America's involvement in the Vietnam War. He was described as a hippie guru who was a large, burly man with electric blue eyes and an unkempt beard, and he seldom washed or bathed. Ira went to the University of Pennsylvania and was described as intelligent and a brilliant student. During this time, he had a relationship with Holly Maddox for 5 years. Holly was from Tyler, Texas, where graduated from Bryn Mawr College in Philadelphia. 1977, Holly broke up with Ira and moved to New York. She had met someone and started dating someone new. Well, Ira found out and he was pissed. He called Holly and told her to come back to Philadelphia. On September 9th, 1977, she did just that. Once she returned to Philadelphia, Holly Maddox was never seen again. Holly's family reported her missing when she stopped calling them. That was so unlike her. So police followed up with Ira regarding Holly's disappearance. He stated to police that Holly left to make a phone call and just never came back. Months later, a downstairs neighbor reported to police a brown liquid that had been leaking through Ira's floorboards into their kitchen. That liquid smelled horrible. They also reported hearing a, quote, blood-curdling, end quote, scream and, quote, several sharp thuds, end quote, around the time of Holly's disappearance. March 29th, 1978, police obtained a search warrant to search Ira's apartment. What they found was Holly's mummified body in a trunk in the bedroom closet. It was packed in styrofoam and had air fresheners and newspapers around it. A post-mortem autopsy revealed that Holly had suffered trauma to her head and her skull was smashed 6 times. The position of her body and the size of the trunk meant that she had actually been alive and semi-conscious when placed in the trunk. She had died trying to claw her way out. Ira's bail was set at $40,000, and his bail was paid by Barbara Bronfman. She was a Montreal Canadian socialite. Her family, the Bronfmans, also known as the world's largest distillery, they owned Seagram's. So Ira was now released from custody. 1981, Ira's murder trial was set to begin. But a few days before that, he skipped bail and fled to Europe. He ended up staying and traveling through Europe for the next 16 years. Ira even got married within that time to a woman named Anika Floden. 1993. Meanwhile, back in Pennsylvania, the state convicted him in absentia of the murder of Holly Maddox. Ira was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 1997, Ira was tracked down and arrested in France. He had been living there under the name Eugene Allen. Extraditing Ira back to the United States was not going to be easy. Under the extradition treaty between France and the United States, either country may refuse extradition if it finds that the defendant may not get a fair trial. Ira's defense argued that he would face the death penalty if he returned to the United States. France, who had abolished the death penalty, does not extradite defendants without assurance that the death penalty will not be sought and will not be applied. Pennsylvania authorities pointed out that at the date of the murder, they did not even have the death penalty. Another issue arose. French law in the European Court of Human Rights requires a new trial when the defendant was sentenced in absentia, stating that the defendant was unable to present their own defense. On this basis, the Court of Appeals rejected the extradition request. This decision by France infuriated so many within the United States. 35 members of Congress sent a letter to President Jacques Chirac of France asking for Ira's extradition. This was done under France's separation of powers. The president cannot give orders to courts and does not intervene in extradition affairs. 1998. As an added measure to try to secure the extradition of Ira, the Pennsylvania legislature passed a bill, which they nicknamed the Einhorn Law. It allows in absentia defendants to request another trial. Meanwhile, in France, the court had freed Ira. However, he was under police supervision. Ira had supporters who would advocate on his behalf. They alleged that he had been unfairly treated by the American criminal justice system and that he would not receive a new trial or a fair trial. The French Green Party in particular complained that Ira should not have to be extradited until the details about his trials were fully determined. In the end, an extradition decree was issued. Ira tried to fight this, but he lost. What did he try to do? He attempted to slit his throat. July 20th, 2001, Ira was extradited to the United States after French authorities were promised that he would receive another trial and would not face the death penalty under any circumstances. Now finally taking the defense in his murder trial, Ira claimed that Holly was murdered by CIA agents who attempted to frame him for the crime. He stated this was due to his investigations on the Cold War and psychotronics. October 17th, 2002. The jury found Ira Einhorn guilty, and this was after only 2 hours of deliberation. He was sentenced to life in prison. Ira's wife, Ira Einhorn, stated, quote, "I cannot say that I know if Ira killed or did not kill Holly. What I'm saying is that the picture that has been presented of Ira as a murderer of Holly is not a picture that matches my picture of Ira, the person I lived with. He's not near this impression. No physical violence, no physical abuse, all these things that he's consecutively presented with. My feeling has always been that Ira is innocent. There has been a feeling, and also a feeling that I've analyzed analytically by exposing him to questions so that I've also convinced myself intellectually," end quote. Ira is currently incarcerated in state prison. And that is the case of Ira Einhorn. Thank you for sticking around for another episode of Danny After Dark. And thank you to Mr. Jinx for the case recommendation. Do you have any questions or comments on the case? Leave it down below. Let's be interactive. Do you have a suggestion for a case that you'd like me to cover? Leave it down below. You may see it featured in an upcoming episode. Until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.